right, you happily miserable accursed. Let's get to it. Like the Thunderbirds, Curse of Politics panelists are go. David Herle here, Kory Teneycke, Scott Reid, Jordan Leichnitz. Get used to the following acronym pod, people. It's going to be a hot NSICOP summer. 1 week ago, the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians released their report that some MPs have been witting participants in foreign interference schemes. We'll try to break that down. Garages set on fire, smashed windows. Our cursed clipping comes from Tonda McCharles writing in the Star about elected officials dealing with rising physical intimidation and threats. Then the long-awaited rate cut from the Bank of Canada. We've come a long way in the fight against inflation, says Bank Governor Tiff Macklem. Political points to be gained here, new narrative for the government, or no? And finally, the celestial Pinsent and our hey yous. Jordan, Scott, Kory, how are y'all?
Doing well.
Good.
Yeah.
In Ottawa today.
Anything to report?
It's still here. It's Ottawa. It's close to Montreal.
Always happy to have you back, Kory.
Scott, did you actually listen to the Strokes, or did you just pretend to listen to the Strokes because it was cool to listen to the Strokes?
I said, kiss my ass, okay? First of all, I think Last Night is possibly the greatest rock song of the 21st century. I think it's so goddamn good. Second of all, I'm fascinated by the Strokes because, as you know, Ryan Adams ruined them. Adams in the early 2000s. Introduced heroin, self-destructive, but mostly exploitative streak of Ryan Adams, and he absolutely fucking killed those guys, just ruined their lives. And then the last thing I'll say, while we're on the topic of music from that era, is 2 weeks today, 2 weeks to this very day, David, we are going to see the Afghan Wigs, and I am pumped about it. In fact, I was checking out the set list early this morning, and do you know the great Dooley sings a cover of a Smith song? I cannot wait. I'm fucking just trembling with anticipation.
There you go. Well, it is going to be a great night. It is going to be a great night. Kory and I saw the Pixies on Saturday night.
Oh man, I love that.
Nice.
I was listening to Pixies this weekend.
Yeah.
It was a little rainy, but thankfully the American Express Lounge was covered. And the bar was wet.
Always rolling high, buddy. Always rolling high.
I was there for Cat Power, but she didn't get much of a chance to show off. A little half-hour set at the beginning. No good sound, nothing. But she's the best. All right, let's get to it here. Treason is on the docket today. There's a committee of MPs created to look at and assess intelligence reports, the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. Chaired by David McGuinty, it released a bombshell report last week. They said certain MPs were wittingly working with foreign governments against Canada's interest. The MPs were not named. The government says it will not release the names. Outrage naturally ensues. Jordan, the assumption publicly seems to be that the government is refusing to release the names to protect Liberals. But it's clear that this report also touches Conservatives. Their leadership race is explicitly mentioned, and they have more connections with India than the Liberals do. So why is the government being secretive about this? Why don't they just release the names?
Well,
I mean, they have developed this reputation for being secretive about this stuff. So why are they taking this additional burden on?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I think that they are not wanting to release the names for some fairly understandable reasons to do with protecting sources. And I think that is, it's tough for me to imagine, for example, if the shoe were on the other foot and we had a Conservative government, I have a difficult time imagining that the Conservative government would immediately come out and release the names. And we can know this because through the Harper years, we had a number of test cases where confidential information was desired for some sort of a public policy purpose. And and there was a great reticence to reveal it, often for the same stated reasons. I think the problem for the Liberals, though, is that a really reflexive answer on this deeply misreads some of the political risk in this file for them. And it's just simply not heard the same way from this government anymore. There is not trust that this government is capable or interested, and the second one is probably the bigger problem, in taking this issue on. So when you have the government coming out and saying that they're not going to release it for sort of standard source protection reasons or using allies' intelligence reasons, it's simply not heard with any charity on the part of people who are following this file. And so I think the challenge that they have is that all of the structures that we have that could deal with this file, so everything from simply suggesting that the RCMP is going to take this information and turn it into charges, when we know that that is not the case, that there's major gaps in the RCMP's ability to turn intelligence into evidence. And the RCMP themselves coming out last week and saying, actually, we can't really tell you anything about what's happening there. So there's no guarantee that that's a viable path. And then, I think the idea of even pushing this to the inquiry that the Liberals didn't want in the first place, so they're not really able to champion that either. And that leaves them effectively saying, well, we've had this report and now we propose precisely nothing. And the last thing I'll say about their response on this that I thought was really stunning, although there were also errors in the Conservative response, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. But you had Freeland out on day one after this report saying that the Liberal Party was going to engage in some sort of an internal investigation around that. Well, that response has been vaporized. It has vanished. It has been swallowed by the earth. And that's a huge problem, because it is absolutely true that as the government, the Liberals do have some constraints around what they can do with the information that they receive in that capacity. But guess who is still an autonomous actor here? That is the Liberal Party of Canada, folks. So you have to ask, even with the limits on what the government can do with the intelligence, why are they no longer talking about the party doing anything? Because I think, and I'd be interested to hear what everybody else has to say, but my sense is that really what's going to happen, if there's any hope for any sort of action on this file in the near term, it is, for better or for worse, going to come down to the parties to do it. And so the fact that the Liberals seem to be walking away from that is pretty worrying.
Yeah. Scott, pick up from this and tell me how the government thinks it's possible that we know that there are traitors and we don't know who they are.
Right. And that's the challenge it's in now. It's locked into that construct. And that's an unsustainable and irrational construct, right? So if there are parliamentarians who have conspired with foreign interests, contrary to the national interest, and more so in order to benefit themselves politically, how is that for a moment tolerable? And yet you have this strange kind of almost consensus, at least initially. The Conservatives peeled off after a day or so, but they initially were part of this consensus where the committee members, the government, the official opposition all seem to kind of be effectively saying, but since we can't disclose any of the information and can't advance any of the information, therefore we can do nothing about it. And we'll just sit on this situation. So, I think, to my mind, and, back in the day, believe it or not, for a few months in the early part of our government, I worked with Rob Wright, our national security advisor at the time, great guy, and handled intelligence files. And saw a little bit of experience in this zone. I don't want to exaggerate it, but I'm kind of gobsmacked by all of this, because if you cannot prove it, you cannot allege it. And I mean that in the sense that if the evidence that supports this is insufficient to take to the RCMP, then you can't allege it in public, because the charge is so enormous. If you can't prove it because you're unpermitted to share the information even with the RCMP, then you can't allege it because the charge is so explosive. And if you're going to ignore all of that and level the suggestion, if you're going to have a report of all committee members, as we have, that says, we're persuaded by the evidence presented to us that we cannot share with you that there are traitors in our midst, then you have to act. Then those people have to be named. And by the way, that could be a grossly unfair and astonishingly perverse circumstance, because those people may not be guilty. Those people may stand based with that allegation on the basis of a misreading by intelligence officers as to how nomination processes unfold. So it's an unsustainable situation. I cannot for the life of me now figure out how it is acceptable. I think there's only two solutions. Either the government says, we're referring this to the RCMP for proper investigation because it's not tolerable to simply say there's nothing we can do, or they have to name the names publicly, at least through party processes by virtue of saying we can't have these people with us. But that is, again, like, how do you stain someone's reputation and standing? Like, if you're going to allege,
Scott, can I stop you for a sec? Scott, can I stop you for a second? I mean, one of the problems with this RCMP argument is that surely there's a standard that isn't criminal.
No. You know what? Sorry, David. I hear that say, of course, if an allegation came forward that, I was running for a nomination and I collaborated and it doesn't rise to criminal, but it's still wrong, then of course the party should take action on me. But we're presented with a situation now where we're at the other end of the telescope. Now we're presented with a situation where the committee says, we're convinced that this occurred, right? So the weight of the committee, they are sworn in. They are all party. And for them to put their imprimatur against a charge that is this astonishing, they have a responsibility. They should have thought two steps ahead. If they're going to say there are traitors in our midst, then only two avenues must then be followed. Either we act on that immediately, name them and deal with it, or at least we reassure Canadians it's being investigated in some fashion. But you, like, yes, of course, it doesn't have to rise to a criminal standard. But then how do you just say it's there and leave it hanging? So I don't accept this argument of, oh, well, it can't be referred to the RCMP because it may not be criminal. Well, then don't fucking say it. Then don't say it. Deal with it then through party processes, or you should have dealt with it already. Both parties.
Yeah. Kory, what's your take?
Yeah, I really disagree with Scott on this. I think that if the MPs on this committee were persuaded by the evidence, then I think there's enough there to exit some people from politics. And my take as to what they're trying to do is trying to get party leadership to read themselves in on this and take action. That's my take. We had a similar discussion if we go back to the Handong situation, in which, the same pleas for the innocence of folks and how it has to rise to a criminal charge. Well, we all know that there will be no criminal charges on the basis of intelligence gathering, right? You're not getting a warrant for it. You're not pursuing a path of criminal investigation that yields evidence that you can use in a court of law. And sometimes these things might not elevate themselves to the level of criminality. But people are thrown out of politics and political parties all the time. In fact, almost always, without there being a criminal outcome. If you get picked up for drunk driving, process.
Yeah.
Well, look, if you get arrested for drunk driving, you're out of caucus day one. You don't wait for the conviction. Like, that's how it works in every party. So, I just don't buy this.
Can I ask a question, Kory? Kory, you and I have had this discussion in a couple of different avenues this past week, and as you mentioned in the past, I struggle. I understand what you're saying. That makes sense. It doesn't even have to be a criminal conviction, or a criminal act like drunk driving. Like, it could just be, we got bad reports on you in terms of the way you conduct yourself with members of the opposite sex or something, and we're just going to quietly dice you. That's the way it goes. And due process.
And it happens all the time.
But this is different, isn't it? Like, if you're going to level on all, I want to ask the question: what could be a more serious charge than treason? And you're going to have an all-party committee say Scott Reid committed treason, and then say, now, it doesn't necessarily rise to the level of criminal standard, but nevertheless, we will name Scott Reid as a traitor, and he will be forever besmirched. And that's just it. Fair or unfair? Like, where is the natural justice in that? If you're going to level an allegation of that severity, that weight, what could be worse? Surely, to Christ, you have to give somebody a mechanism to defend their name.
There are examples of this. Like, think back to Bob Deckert and his relationship with a member of the Chinese state media that was deemed to be inappropriate. Like, and that situation was dealt with. Like, and look, the Han Dong situation in its own way was dealt with. It was dealt with him being removed from caucus. And we had an example with the provincial PC party, so a similar nature to the Han Dong situation that was dealt with. I think this touches on all parties, is my guess. And even if, and obviously, I don't know, we don't have the unredacted version of this, but I think it's a safe assumption that all parties are touched. Certainly the Ontario PC party was touched by this in a minor way. And it was dealt with. And even if the Conservatives were not in this instance, there's a good chance they're going to be government in another 18 months. And the actors that are involved here will attempt to do all these same things. And so I think it's incumbent on parties to police themselves. And I think all the leaders should be right in on this. I think Poilievre's making a mistake by not getting a look at the intelligence, and it's, I think, an opportunity to lead by example. And if there's anybody in the Conservative caucus who's been pursuing inappropriate communications with foreign state actors, they should be removed from caucus and say, well, we can't share all the details, but we took a look at it and we deemed it to be serious enough to take action. I think that's the best path. And I hear what you're saying in terms of, this is shouting fire in a theater without, a clear path to the exit for anybody. I don't think it was well thought out by the people on this committee as to what the natural repercussions of making those accusations public. But I'm glad they made them.
I actually think that it was intentional. If you look at the way the committee is constructed and the terms of their work, to me, this reads as though the committee is actually trying to raise the alarm within the bounds of what they have available to them as tools, And this has always been the challenge with this setup, right? Because anything that's really of import goes through the Prime Minister and can be redacted at that level. And so if you are on that committee and you are seeing something that you feel is not being addressed, that the committee feels is not being addressed as a national security threat, this is your avenue. This is your only way, really, is to try to get that into the report that would go public to raise the alarm. And it's really not, I have to say, it's not on the committee to find the solution to that, for better or for worse. That was never the intent of what their role was, and nor do they really have the power to do that within their mandate and the legislation that governs their work. That's on the government. That's on the government. And also, this is something now, we've been dealing with this for well over a year. So all of these allegations, the difference now is that we now have a sense that potentially the parliamentarians were active participants, knowing or half-witted or, half-witting participants in this. And so that's really the shift, right? So then I think that when you look at all of the other reports, those were things that parties had no control over. This is something that they do. And I absolutely agree. I'm also worried that some of these allegations might not be true. They might be minor. They might be misinterpreted. And there is a fundamental issue of fairness here. But I think that in the environment that we're in right now, we haven't solved that problem yet, right? We've had over a year with this issue, and there really hasn't been a clear way forward that allows some sort of public discussion of this for due process for folks. And so I'm not really confident that that's going to get resolved before nominations open up again. And there is, I think, a more fundamental issue, which is that Canadians have a right to know that anybody who is running as a candidate who they might be voting for is not involved in this type of an affair. And so I think that's where it flips back to the parties. And I totally agree with Kory. I think that Poilievre is making a really big mistake in not being read in and taking some leadership and some responsibility on the issue, and being seen to be kind of proactive and serious on this rather than looking to score points in terms of getting in on that intelligence early on. That is the way to get your hands on this quickly and to get your hands around the issue in your own party. And Singh and the NDP wrote they're doing that. The Bloc said that they're going to consider that. I think that is, if you're in the opposition, that is the way to go. But interestingly, of course, the Prime Minister has had this report now since the end of March. So if there are Liberals involved, he knows. And so so that kind of, for me, that flips back to the question about what's going on with the Liberal Party. Where is this internal review? What is their path forward? Because right now, they're the only ones who know.
So picking up where we left off last week, Wildfires are already raging, right this second, in Canada. 2023 was our most destructive season on record. I won't quote any statistics because I think we all remember it too well. This year threatens to be worse, the result of climate change and an unusually warm, dry spring. But you've got to know, nobody's just sitting around, resigned to watching it all burn down. Investment in new ideas, real commitment and action, brings hope. Last week I told you about TELUS's Pollinator Fund for Good, putting money and resources into dryad networks, sensor technology deployed in BC's boreal forests to detect wildfires in their earliest smoldering phases. Another example is Flash Forest, reforestation technology that blends AI, drones, and ecological science to plant trees in fire-ravaged areas in the fastest and most massive scale imaginable. It works like this. Remote-operated drones fire seeds that can germinate even in drought conditions at super high velocity into the soil, 20 seeds a second, and up to 1 million trees a day now. The goal is growing 1 billion trees in Canada over the next several years, transforming how tree planting gets done. More trees, faster, helps reverse climate change. So far, the TELUS Pollinator Fund for Good has invested almost $50 million into innovative startups like Flash Forest, driving social and environmental change for a better world. Investments that TELUS wants to keep making. Dose of reality, regulatory conditions play a role in how much they can do. Right now, the government is laying groundwork for a new wholesale regime. TELUS believes the best way forward is a tailored approach that recognizes regional differences, as well as the companies who keep investing in their services and how they can make Canada a better place to live. Okay, so
Can I
building on what Jordan said, I just want to throw two setup pieces in for round two of this discussion. One of which is something seems to be happening over the weekend, and maybe a consensus is emerging here, because I believe that the Bloc proposed, and now the Conservatives, Scheer issued a letter this morning saying that they want this to go to the Hogue Committee. So I don't think the Conservatives are any more calling for the release of the names today. I think they want this report to go to the public inquiry, and the public inquiry will decide what to do with this information. So point number one, is that going to be sufficient? Second of all, just on politics, the thing that caught my eye, and Scott, it wasn't just from Freeland, who we would expect this from, but from Dominic, who we wouldn't, which was, I thought, a really tone-deaf initial response to this, which is everybody who heard this in Canada said, holy fuck, hair on fire. But the government was like, another day at the office, people accused a traitor in the House of Commons, no big deal. Like it made them look uninterested again in getting to the truth of this. I don't get it. Anyway, pick up where you
Well, I agree. I agree with that. I agree with that strongly. And I was really disappointed. I think when you have a charge this significant, the only answer is what's happening next. And to sort of act like, well, here's what it is. We can't do anything about it. But I want to zero in on Freeland because it highlights a question I'd like to know the answer to, which touches on Kory, because what Kory's had to say, because naturally I agree with Kory that I'd like to have seen proactive efforts, or at least earlier efforts on the part of the parties to say, all right, like what's going on here? We got to act. And you know what? If the gray is that dark, then we just got to move these people out of the way. So I'd like to know this. Freeland goes out, freelances, and says all of this will be investigated by the party, and then basically just has to, in her typical clumsy, terrible communications strategy fashion. But I'd like to know this question. Have these names been investigated? Has the Liberal Party, as an example, or the Conservative Party, if there are Conservatives who are touched on in this, have they already looked into this? Did they were they aware of it prior to the report in March? Were they aware of it because, they saw things that concerned them? Or if it was the government party, the Liberals, did they get warnings that caused them to say, hang on a second? And the reason that's an important question is, if it has been investigated and they determined that the charges are groundless, that the allegations are not fair and not accurate, well then, A, they haven't said that in public, and that's another mechanism to deal with it. You could come out through the front door and say, it's Scott Reid and David Herle, and we have looked into it, and we are convinced, and we will stand by them. We're convinced these charges are wrong. So that's one possible avenue that's not being contemplated. And then secondly, it also means that an all-party committee reviewed possibly the same information that the parties looked at, but came to the contrary conclusion. And that's worrying, because it makes you wonder, well, how could it be that some Liberal members and a bunch of other members came to the conclusion that it is supportable and the party didn't? So I'd like to know if there's been an investigation.
Well, I'm not sure we can assume it's the same
renamed.
information, right? Like that's the other thing.
Well, I'm gonna finish my round one and then try to get in on round 2 and 3 here that you guys have embarked on. Look, politics isn't fair. It isn't about due process. Like, that's just not the way any of this works. And we all know that. We've all worked in this realm long enough to know that the candidates get booted for all kinds of reasons and all kinds of things. And there isn't a jury of your peers and lawyers sitting across from one another, litigating these things. It is a balance of probabilities. It is a sniff test. It is do I want to defend this person in this action in public or not? That's the test. And I don't see why we would create a different set of rules and different standard of things around really serious things, as opposed to, everything else that's used to determine whether somebody should sit in caucus or not. So, let's just judge people on the same basis in which we judge them in every other circumstance. So I'm just uncompelled by any of that portion of it. I also think that everything will come out, because this is Ottawa. And way too many people know whose names are in those reports. And this is a town that lives on gossip and rumors and telling stories and sharing things that aren't supposed to be shared. And it's only a matter of time before this comes out, which leads me to the last point that I'd make. We need to come up with a system, like a process, a way of dealing with these questions that doesn't involve leaking it to the fucking media. Because right now, that is the only way you get anything done in terms of reform at RCMP, at DND, at CSIS, at CSE. These organizations have been notoriously bad at, taking these kinds of issues seriously, whether it's internal stuff, whether it's, stuff related to espionage, all the sensitive stuff. They sort of step on their dick every time they walk about the room. And, we need to find a way that doesn't involve Bob Fife putting it on the front page of the Globe and Mail in order to get action taken. And if we can't come up with another way, that's the way it's going to be done. And for all of this stuff about not sharing sources and due process and everything, that is the most difficult to defend method of dealing with these issues. And that's the one that we're using right now. And it would appear to me what we're going to continue to use, because I don't see any steps by anyone to come up with an alternative plan.
Kory, is the whole committee the right place for this to go?
Well, I think it's where it's going to end up, is in the media, but it's because no one is dealing with it proactively. And as we saw in the genesis of all of this, remember how this all started is people at CSIS, throwing flags and giving warnings and having them fall on deaf ears in the PMO and in senior ranks of the government, to the point where they started giving the material to Bob Fife, and he was putting it out, and then, was forced to the point of having a public inquiry about it. So, I guess we've learned nothing is the upshot of this. We've learned nothing. There's been zero evolution towards an approach that takes these things more seriously and has a non-media centric resolution path.
I think the Hogue Committee is the wrong place, absolutely, to kick this. That's just about pushing this down the road. And I think the problem with that is because what they're asking her to do is to make a finding of fact in each of these cases. And that's all well and good. But I think, and this maybe touches a bit on what Kory was saying about nominations and parties, but the problem is that the finding of fact can be completely distinct from what would be politically acceptable or not acceptable for a party in terms of allowing somebody to stand for nomination again. So I think you actually can land yourself in an even thornier situation down the road if you come out and you have these findings of fact but you still have concerns. Maybe things didn't rise to a certain level, but they're indicative of judgment that is not good, or other problems. Where does that leave the parties? And it's not clear to me that you would even then be able to release this information. So if Justice Hogue does these finding of facts, well, what are we going to get to know? Are we going to get to know the names at the end of that? That's still not clear.
You can't outsource it. You can't outsource it. You can't.
No, they want to outsource
it. You can't.
What I'm saying is you can't, because you're this is just it's a form of delay in my view, and I think that it's going to actually worsen the political problems down the road. You're going to end up in the fall, in October, with none of these things solved, and no structure to actually deal with this.
The opportunity for the leadership of each of the parties is to take a look at it themselves, make a determination as to whether somebody has done something wrong, and if they have, say goodbye to them and say we can't share the reasons why, but we have determined that this person is no longer suitable to sit in our caucus, and we're not going to get into details, but that's the conclusion. And you can trust us because we have every incentive of cleaning this up. But I don't think you can't outsource that to a third party. That is what party leadership is about. And if you want to lead a party, then lead.
I think it's worse than that. I think it is a mechanism delay. I don't think they're trying to outsource just the problem. I think they're actually trying to outsource the decision to maintain confidentiality.
Wait a second, Scott. What if, like Jordan says, the PM's had the report since March?
Right. So
what if he kind of disagrees with it? Isn't Hogue a reasonable third party to take a look at it?
Well, possibly. That's why I'm not so certain that it isn't constructive to have a finding of fact, because if Hogue comes to determination that these allegations are not substantiated, then you're left, hopefully in a better place. But you're still
it's the wrong threshold.
I don't think it solves the political problem.
Well, that's the question.
Fact is the wrong threshold. Like we don't. That's once again back to the first point. We don't use findings of fact to make these decisions in the normal course of business.
But if you're going to blowtorch a person's life and career on the basis that they are a traitor, then I think a finding of fact is maybe not an unfair standard and insufficient standard.
You don't have to, and like this stuff has been litigated. Remember Helena Gurgis's case of not wanting to be thrown out for basically being a bad minister, etc. Like she actually sued the government. Like
they're not comparable.
And what came out is parties are private clubs, and they get to determine who's in caucus. And they don't have to have a reason and a finding of fact. And and who ends up in cabinet? That's up to the prime minister. Like that's just how it works. And
what we talk
and it should work this way as well, because what we have right now,
Kory, that's about whether or not she was a bitch and yelled at her staff. This is about whether or not you're a fucking traitor to your country.
Okay, well, so
I just don't know that you can you can be cavalier about saying the stain is going to be on someone's name forever.
What happened with Han Dong? That's basically what we saw happen, right? And people can make their own judgments looking at his testimony, etc. I myself, my opinion is he looked guilty as hell. And other people might come up with a different opinion on that, right? But what's important is ultimately the prime minister came to that, or at least came to the decision that he wasn't worth defending, and he couldn't defend the things that this guy had done. And so he was removed. And yes, his name is being dragged through the mud. I think justifiably so, on the basis of the actions that we know publicly. But ultimately, the prime minister, without having a finding of facts and all of that, made a determination that that was the defensible path with respect to that individual. I think you got to go through a similar process with the other names on this list. And if you don't, it's going to be tried in the media, because all this stuff is going to land on Bob Fife's desk as sure as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west.
I would be worried, absolutely, that I think that especially if they go through the Hogue Commission as a form of delay, in the interim, if those names come out, then the hands of all the party leaders will be forced, and there will be nothing even approaching anything like an investigation or anything like that. They won't have any choice. So I think they are far better off, each of the party leaders, to get that information now and to undertake whatever internal processes that they want to do in their own parties to deal with that, because if those names come out and nothing like that has been done, there will be no choice and there will be no right of reply for those people.
I think you guys are right ultimately, because the reality is that the party leaders, not as the leader of the official opposition and not as the leader of the government of Canada, but the party leaders, I think they already know. Like, I'll just speak for the Liberals. My guess, here's what I think. What I honestly think, I think that they know who's been accused, obviously. I think that they have looked into it. I think that they have made a determination that they think the evidence is insufficient and unfair, and they're unwilling to label that person or persons. And therefore, but they don't want to take the heat of saying so in public. And my guess is that Poilievre and his operation feel exactly the same way about whatever conservatives have been similarly accused. But they don't want to take the heat of coming out and saying, I'm holding a press conference to say it's Scott Reid. And you know what? I don't buy it. And so we're standing by him. They know that in the current environment, that'll be a blowtorch. They don't want to put themselves through it. So they're effectively saying, sorry, we can't disclose this information. We can't discuss this information. And now they're looking for a process out. And that's what
I just don't think you get it both ways.
It's unrealistic that that's going to be the case. Like, this is too big a story. This is like the question of who is deep throat and like the Nixon affair, right? Like, people are going to chase this story till the end of time,
and because it can't be unresolved, right? It lays over both houses of Parliament now until something moves, and so there's huge incentive for this story to continue to be covered with great intensity.
So the wildfires burning out west right now are different. They are bigger and they are more ferocious, and some of them are unstoppable. They are straining the country's capacity to cope. Experts now talk about coexisting with forest fires rather than controlling them. They have become natural disasters on par with tornadoes and hurricanes. Last year was the most destructive on record. Fires in BC actually killed 6 firefighters. And the federal government is predicting another potentially catastrophic summer as the western drought enters its 3rd year and temperatures continue to spike. Our sponsor, CN, will be in the thick of it. CN's trains will continue to roll. They simply must for the sake of the economy. Sometimes trains are the first on the scene of a wildfire in the Canadian wilderness. And 3 of CN's trains will actually go out looking for fires. Their names are Poseidon, Neptune, and Trident. They are actual firefighting trains, able to reach and suppress wildfires often more quickly than traditional first responders. Until this year, Poseidon did battle alone. Neptune and Trident were unveiled by the railway last week. Each of them carries 49,000 gallons of water, foam, and fire retardant, along with pumps, hoses, and water cannon. Their crews are specially trained CN employees and contractors. Neptune and Trident are also equipped with 2 360-degree cameras, one at either end of the train, providing fire officials with a real-time line of sight. The 3 firefighting trains will provide CN with a powerful suppressive counterpunch, capable of keeping tracks open and routes clear. By now, everyone understands the destructive force of climate change. There is no choice but to adapt. That is what CN is doing. It will spare no effort to ensure its trains continue to leave and arrive on time, and to help keep communities along its network safe. That's a promise. All right, you know what? That conversation was so vigorous, so intense. We're going to have to skip our clipping this week. So, Tonda, my apologies. It was a great clipping. We'll probably come back to it, certainly the subject. But let's move on to our next topic, which is Tiff Macklem. He's our hero fighting for our nation. Little Roger Ramjet there for the old crowd.
It was often compared to Brian Mulroney.
Anyway, the Bank of Canada lowered interest rates. Only a quarter point, but it's a start. The problem is that the reason they felt comfortable doing that is because the economy is absolutely flat on its back.
Ding, ding.
And so, Scott, assuming that this is the first of a series of rate cuts over the next year, how does the government start creating a narrative of economic turnaround?
Well, poor Kory, he's he's been subjected to listening to me talk about this. Like, I think it's the third time in the past 5 days. So, sorry.
I agree with what you have to say. So
I have a really clear
just gonna
view.
go get a coffee.
Yeah, no. Apparently, the show's repetitive, folks. You can turn off now and.
Well, I'm repetitive, is all I'm saying. The reality is that I think both the government and the official opposition kind of muffed the response to the interest rate cut. I thought that the government was really, really ham-fisted. The way Freeland came out and said this cut can occur, and it obviously represents the beginning of a golden era where people will drink from rivers of beautiful, clean water and pick fruit from trees, and all will be well. And it's because we have steered the economy so well that we're at this point where interest rates can be cut. I thought that was terribly tone deaf. Don't take credit. Don't claim credit. Give credit. I thought the Conservatives were unwise to call it small change and try to diminish it and look like they are cheering for bad news and fear good news and worry that that's going to remove a political advantage for them. What do I think the government should do? I think the government should take advantage of this moment and say, look, first of all, Canadians deserve whatever credit there is to have if we're able to finally get moving a little bit. Second of all, what we really have to have now is a debate, which is that if we're starting to turn the corner where interest rates may start to come down, and that may mean that we can get a little bit more movement in our economy, what do we want to have as an argument going forward about what the choices are to steer that committee? We think Pierre Poilievre is going to cut critical services. We think that's going to include the ability to draw all those plants and jobs to Canada like we're doing with Premier Doug Ford in Ontario. We think he's going to undermine the tenets of jobs and growth. And have a debate about the future. Don't have an argument with Canadians about why they should be applauding them for what the government has done. See, as it turns out, the interest rate cut proves that we were right all along. You are doing better. Spain, eat our ass. We are crushing you. Therefore, celebrate us and reelect us.
Right. Kory, what do you think? They've got a rate cut. They've got something to work with now?
Well, look, good news is good news, and a rate cut is good news. So, like, I agree with everything Scott said in terms of, I think, how they missed the mark in terms of celebrating it too much and taking too much credit for it. I think it's all bang on from a comms perspective. But that said, I'd rather flub the comms on good news than really nail the comms on shitty news. And they've had a lot of shitty news on the economy over the last couple of years. So I'm sure even in the imperfection of their response to it, this is basically an inflection point for the government where things are at least moving in the right direction. And we'll see whether there's more rate cuts and whether there's a trend line that starts to develop. So like that's fine. Why do I think it probably doesn't change the ultimate course and direction for the government is, we're 20 points of inflation at this point, probably more than that. And people have had, 2 or 3 points of wage growth. So they're way worse off. That's right. And they've had to renegotiate their mortgage, but their mortgage is renegotiated at a much higher number, and they're stuck with that for 2, 3, 4 years, whatever the case may be. And they're not gonna pivot as quickly. Look, by the time Chrétien came in '93, the economy was well into a recovery, and that didn't help. The Conservatives, they still got thrown out on their ass.
Right.
And so, I think it can be too little too late. We've talked about in the past how the economy is sort of a trailing indicator, not a leading indicator in a sense, like that the hangover of bad economic news has, goes on into the future. The turnaround is always felt more slowly. So I think all of that stuff is true, but and I also agree with the critique on the Conservatives and the warning in terms of what they need to watch out for. You don't want to be looking like you're cheerleading bad news, but you still want to drive a contrast. And I think there's a really wide path for the Conservatives to continue to do so. these guys have messed it up a lot, and you're feeling it, and we are the solution, and and let's get to an election.
Jordan?
Yeah, I mean, I agree pretty much with everything that's been said. And I would just add, I think one of and this is just the perversity of rates, right? It's, as you said in the introduction, the reason that the rates can begin to come down is because the economy has flatlined. And so that means that people are they're not feeling better, even if of course, a quarter point cut is good news. It's maybe the beginning of the end, but that's a very long road back. And I think if you look carefully at what the bank is saying, what is the risk to future rate cuts? Well, it could be wage growth, right? So this is a real challenge because people are still absolutely feeling the pinch. They are maybe staring down a mortgage renegotiation still much higher than what they had initially signed at. Food prices, yes, the growth of those food prices has slowed, but the prices have not come down. Prices are still really high. So all of the irritants in the economy that people are feeling month to month, and what's making them feel like they can't get ahead, and what's making them feel so frustrated with the government, none of those things have disappeared. So I do think that there was a miss on the part of the Liberals, not just in trying to take credit for it, which I think is really bizarre because, of course, if they can take credit for a cut, then is it also their fault when there's a rate hike? But I also think that it furthers what is really one of their more fundamental problems, which is an inability to empathize and to understand with where most people are at. And it's true that it's good news. It's true that I think psychologically it's very important. It's true that it's important for beginning a trend towards cuts. Those things are all really significant. And I don't want to say that it's meaningless because I actually think quite the opposite. It is really important. But I think it's important also when conservatives, liberals, anyone's talking about this, is to understand what's like the full picture of the economy that makes this possible and how that's lived by regular people. And that was a bit missing, I thought, actually, from both responses last week.
Let me stick with you for a second, Jordan, because you and Scott and Kory are all agreeing that the government went for credit in a clumsy way when the rate cut was announced. But surely they need credit. Like sometime over the course of the next year, they need people to say, well, there have been 3 or 4 rate cuts, and the economy is starting to show some activity. And I attribute that to the sound management of the government. They need that.
Yeah, I think that's not realistic that credit would be attributed in that fashion to them at this point. Because if you want to talk about it that way, then really that would be about credibly claiming that the government has reined in spending enough to not fuel inflation, and it's not a credible story, right, for this government to be telling. I think rather the credit that they should be looking for, the story that they want to tell, is that I am feeling more optimistic about my financial future. I am feeling like when I have to renegotiate my mortgage next year, like I've got a chance. I am feeling, like I've got enough money to make it through to the next paycheck. Like that is the credit I think that they're looking for, not necessarily the sort of sound fiscal management overall stuff. Like I think for sure for within the bubble here in Ottawa, that's important. But in terms of how people are living it, they are not going to understand it in those terms, and they need to have a sense that their own lives are feeling easier, that they're feeling less of a sense of a scramble. And I think that's really what the government should be looking for in terms of credit. I don't know how they would get it, though, at this stage.
Well, can I be really blunt as to how they might get it? Trudeau has to leave. Because and we were talking about this over the weekend, David, my dog ran away. Fuck Trudeau. It's raining out. Fuck Trudeau. I missed the bus this morning. Fuck Trudeau. Like it doesn't matter what happens right now. Like that is the conclusion for like 70% of the electorate.
Yeah, I mean, if Kyla's research said that people are unprepared to concede that he's energetic, they're unlikely to concede that he's running the economy well.
So, look, I think some of what Scott and Jordan said, like it's true. Like I'd probably add in something about how we're going to continue to support Canadians while we work our way through this process, and we're going to make sure that that there are supports there for them. Like all those kind of liberal standard fair lines, I think have some efficacy. There's a reason why they're tried and true. However, delivered from the lips of Freeland and Trudeau, I just don't think it goes anywhere. I don't think there is a path for them. I think it's just that. I think that's just that simple.
That's all a very fair point, and obviously it hangs over everything right now at this moment. The only thing I would say in generic political communications terms, right? You never receive explicit credit in government. When you seek it, it's almost always denied to you. You can gain implicit credit, but that's not by dragging people back to the past. It's by luring them toward the future. If you can start a debate about what the next best thing to do to strengthen our economy is, then by the time people arrive at that debate, they'll be implicitly conceding that the challenge they felt is starting to be surmounted. And you are getting implicit credit for that. But you can never, ever, ever be received by walking through the front door of the voter's home and saying, "Hi, would you like to thank me for your brand new washer and dryer?" It just doesn't work.
You never get thanks for stuff in the rearview mirror. You're absolutely right. It's like what's the next problem you're solving? Well, what are you going to do for me tomorrow, right? Like, because it's not even, I don't even think it's what have you done for me lately as much as what are you promising to do tomorrow? Like, do you actually get the concerns that I'm talking about, and do you have a plan to get me from where I am today that is not perfect to something that's more perfect tomorrow?
And you don't hear that from Trudeau, and you don't hear that from Biden, and it's a big problem for both guys.
With a changed electorate, you better be offering something, and other than just a rosy picture of your record, which no one believes.
So the capital gains tax is up for a vote this week, maybe. It's being introduced in the House this week. The Liberals obviously have high hopes. This is the hammer from the budget. And they think Poilievre's going to look bad no matter what he does. Kory, what do you think?
Well, I'm probably an outlier on this, but I would vote for it if I were Poilievre, because I think that the message to be on is the one that's been working for him, which is carbon tax and housing and renewed focus on the economy. It's all of those things, and this is so obviously a trap. It is a trap of equal obviousness to the trap that was the federal scab legislation. And, sometimes you just have to walk past those. And look, there'll be an opportunity when you're in government to make all kinds of changes to all kinds of things, including the capital gains. But, going out and defending boomers who are worried about paying more tax on their third or fourth property to millennials who don't own a single property is not what I would call a good frame. I think it's just in every way a worse focal point for this than what has been working for Poilievre. And so, if it ain't broken, don't fix it. I would just keep on the same message track and same focus that he has been on, because I think it's very clearly working.
Scott, Jordan, anybody expecting anything interesting out of this?
I mean, I agree with Comrade Kory here. I think that the Conservatives have shown that they're have some discipline around some of these things that are more obvious traps. Although I will say, I thought that the Liberal gambit of splitting it off and forcing a standalone vote, like I tip my hat. That was like an unusual amount of energy for this particular government, and a little bit of fight in there. So that's always, I guess, good to see. But I don't think he's going to fall for it. I think that they will. I think they will vote for it, and on exactly the grounds that Kory talks about, which is that when they're in government, they can go back over this and many other things. But that the vulnerability, the risk that the Conservatives could be painted as defending the very wealthy, those who have multiple homes, over and above those who have none, I think is probably too big of a political risk. Though we can hope that I'm wrong.
I may be wrong, by the way. I'm not saying that. I'm saying what I would do. I'm not saying with great confidence that's where they're going to end up, because I think they're terribly cross-pressured on it.
Yeah, the anti-scab is to me an indication of what those conversations are looking like internally right now. So we'll see.
I think they could just as easily jump up and say, you know what, any tax is a bad tax, and we're just not going to be in that business. So on that basis, that's that. The insight that drives this, and I do like the game that the Liberals have shown, and by platforming it in its own bill and forcing a vote and causing people maybe to modestly notice that Poilievre doesn't want to answer the question. I know a conservative radio host who interviewed Poilievre last week, and he wouldn't answer the question on capital gains, and even she found that frustrating. But it's all premised on the insight that people like this measure, that when people learn, because they don't really know, a lot of Canadian voters, that, there's a differing tax regime under capital gains, that it's available largely to those who have more assets than the rest of us, and that it's, the tax fairness argument has some traction. I'm not convinced that they've cemented that argument, though, with Canadians, and therefore I think the power of this vote may be less substantial.
Look at the stakes that Freeland raised it to yesterday, though.
Well,
Scott.
This is where I wanted to go, David. I'm going to read it. Here's what she said. And this is my point. I'm not convinced that they've actually been able to make and land this argument of tax fairness and have it framed and understood by people as such. She said yesterday in her latest attempt to get people to view it through that prism, do you want to live in a country where those at the very top live lives of luxury but must do so in gated communities behind even higher fences, using private health care on airplanes because the public sphere is so degraded and the wrath of the vast majority of their less privileged compatriots burns so hot? I mean, that is Old Testament. That is like just a little over the top. It's like we will grab the rich and we will choke them with bags of solid silver coins and they will fear us. It's just like...
Well, if that's your diagnostic, this measure is a little small to deal with it, isn't it?
Right?
No kidding.
That's the problem. I know everyone. I want to just welcome I want to welcome Kory. I want to welcome Minister Freeland. Please come to an NDP nomination meeting, friends. We will teach you how to talk about these issues, and like it is a little less literary. Let me just...
Again.
And I mean,
so
I
clumsy.
am blown away. Like there is actually a simple way to talk about this, right? Do you believe that people who make their money from investments should be taxed fairly in the same way that people who make their money from wages and work?
So bang on. Oh my God.
So
Terry just pulls her hair out on the couch watching this go down. Why don't you just use that argument?
Yeah.
Over and over and over again. But instead, it's like, no, it says plutocrats, frothy, we will hang the rich. Or or worse yet, we run the risk that the poor will kill the rich.
We're saving the rich because if we don't do this, then the
look at who's left in the
proletariat are going to kill the rich.
Yeah. Like it's like she's talking to those folks in gated communities. That's all that's left.
Yeah.
Ditch diggers and arc welders are going to scramble over the gates of your home and hang you in your living room.
Right, the revolution
but for us in this capital
friends.
gains measure, like maybe just introduce a little more common sense to your language construction.
Okay, maybe only Gordon Pinson can save this podcast now. Gordon?
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
Right. Who's got a hey you?
I do.
I'll go first. Because I'm just
first.
boring us.
You go.
I'm going to bore us with the same thing. My hey you is to Chrystia Freeland. And I'm sorry to be such a goddamn scold and over again. But as today's discussion highlights, okay, in the past 5 days, since Wednesday of last week, here we are on Monday, 3 flubs, 3 strategic and execution flubs. First, as we talked about, interest rate tries to claim credit, a real flub, misreads the whole thing, badly executed. Second, foreign interference, when she's asked about it, says that the party's conducting an investigation. That has to be taken out to the back 40, shot and buried beneath the soil. Third, capital gains, this rhetoric that's being elevated to cartoonish heights and therefore obscuring the more common sense argument that I think kind of tells you that they failed to do it. If the economy is strengthening, if there's any hope in the next 14 months for this government to turn itself around, other than or possibly in addition to the Prime Minister stepping aside and giving people a chance to look at the Liberals again and anew, Chrystia Freeland simply this can't continue. Like 3 times in 5 days. How often have we talked about it? You have to acknowledge, the first step is to acknowledge the problem. Clearly, this can only occur because she is not facing up to the fact that she needs to work harder and be more strategic and more disciplined as a communicator. She obviously cannot believe that and is not acting to correct it. And so I say, please get thee to a church basement, stand up in a crowd of people and say, my name is Christia and I am a flawed communicator. She's got to get to the AA of political communication fast.
All right, Kory, what do you got?
Well, I got an attaboy here for a friend of the podcast, Peter Bethlenfahvy. I was very pleased to see, probably much to the chagrin of the Ontario PCs are not real conservatives crowd, TBRS upgraded the bond rating for the province of Ontario. So great news, great fiscal management, Peter. Well done. Keep it up. And to the critics, go fuck yourself.
That's just the
That's
family
right,
compact.
Don't mind those 13-hour ER waits.
Oh my God, rebuttals.
Looking after each other.
Rebuttals to Hey Yous now. All right, Jordan.
Okay, so my Hey You this week is going out to Shannon Phillips. So Shannon, as many listeners will know, is an Alberta NDP MLA, former environment minister in the Notley government, and she announced that she's going to be stepping down yesterday. And I wanted to really raise my glass and send a shout out for her work. She's incredibly principled, passionate. She's a fighter. She's, I think, got just tons of political talent. As minister, she left behind a more politically durable carbon price than the federal Liberal government has. So she made a huge impact in her time as minister and her time in government. And she also had to deal with just a really almost unthinkable amount of abuse, both of the standard kind that politicians have come sadly to expect in Canada, and also of a really particular kind where the Lethbridge police were involved in completely illegal and inappropriate surveillance of her, searching, following her for political reasons that I think should rightly leave everybody who's involved in politics really shaken that could happen here in Canada. It was wrong, and it's wrong also, I think, that they didn't bring charges on these folks, and I think it really cost us somebody who was talented and who's just really the type of person that you would want to have involved in politics, is hanging up their hat, I think, in large part because of that. And so that's unfortunate. That sucks. We're a lesser country because of it, and I just wanted to send a hey you out to Shannon for her work and really salute her for the legacy that she's left, which is significant.
Oh, very nice. Very nice. Hear, hear. And mine also goes out to Chrystia Freeland, to Minister Freeland. Minister Freeland, you got the field to yourself here. You've got the rate cut cycle. You've got the budget vote you want. And the government desperately needs to improve its economic competence. You're reputed to be a potential leader. Let's see what you got. Run with this. This is your opening. Need you to be successful. The party, the government needs you to take this narrative, take this story and run with it and build a story about economic growth. 1984, it's morning in America. That's the turnaround story you're looking for. And it's on you. So let's see what you got. Go for it. All right, that's our show for this week. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS. I'd like to thank our sponsor, CN Rail. I'd like to thank Scott, Jordan, and Kory for another vigorous roundtable. One day we got to do this in a bar and see how reedy down and dirty this conversation can get. Thank all of you accursed who watched or listened, and take care of yourselves. We'll see you next week.